Are you deaf, old man? I said, Move. It. The voice, sharp and serrated, cut through the quiet hum of the barracks. Willie Pratt didn't flinch. At 81, he'd learned that the loudest noises were often the least threatening. He continued his work, guiding the wet mop in slow overlapping arcs, the scent of bleach and pine rising from the freshly cleaned linoleum. The floor gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a perfect mirror of the ceiling above. The voice belonged to Petty Officer Thorne, a man carved from granite and impatience. He stood with two other SEAL candidates, all of them radiating the restless, predatory energy of caged lions. They were young, their muscles coiled like springs under their tight T-shirts, their faces still holding the arrogant certainty that the world was something to be conquered, not endured. I've got a gear inspection in 10, and you're polishing the floor like it's a crown. Jewels. Thorne snapped, taking a step closer. His boots, spotless and black, stopped just shy of the wet floor. A small island of defiance in Willie's sea of clean. This is a barracks, not a ballroom. Get your bucket and go. Willie finished his act, his movements unhurried, economical. He straightened his back, a slow creaking process that seemed to annoy Thorne even further. Willie's eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, met the petty officers. They were calm, observant, and held a depth that Thorne mistook facility. Almost done, son, Willie said, his voice a low growly rasp. It wasn't defiant, merely factual. I'm not your son, Thorne sneered. The other two candidates chuckled, a low rumble of pack-animal amusement. I'm the guy telling you to get out of the way. Now, the confrontation had drawn a small audience. A few other trainees, fresh from their morning run, lingered by their bunks, pretending to sort their gear while their eyes flickered toward the scene unfolding in the central corridor. This was Thorne's domain, and the old janitor had trespassed on his authority. Thorne was a star in the brutal constellation of basic underwater demolition SEAL training. He was faster, stronger, and meaner than almost anyone else in his class. He thrived on the pain, on the instructors screaming, on the frigid shock of the Pacific. He saw the world as a hierarchy of strength, and the stooped frail man with the mop was at the absolute bottom, an obstacle, a ghost who haunted the edges of their elite world, smelling of disinfectant and irrelevance. You know, Thorne said, circling Willie slowly, I don't think you should be in here at all. This is a secure area. We have mission-critical equipment, training protocols. What's to stop you from being some kind of spy, listening and poking around? Willie leaned on his mop, his gnarled hands resting on the worn wooden handle. I have a clearance. They checked. Thorne scoffed, stopping directly in front of Willie, forcing the old man to crane his neck to look up at him. You look like you couldn't remember your own name. Let me see some ID. The demand hung in the air, a deliberate escalation. A janitor didn't get asked for ID by a trainee. It was a power play, a public humiliation. Willie's gaze didn't waver. He simply reached into the pocket of his red coveralls and pulled out a worn, cracked leather wallet. His movements were steady, betraying no anger or fear. He was an island of calm, in a sea of simmering testosterone. He fumbled for a moment with the plastic sleeve, his arthritic fingers struggling with the task. Thorne let out an exaggerated sigh. Any day now, Grandpa, we've got a war to train for. Finally, Willie slid out his base access identification card and held it out. Thorne snatched it from his hand. He glanced at it, then back at Willie. Smirk playing on his lips. Willie Pratt. Well, Willie Pratt, your picture looks like it was taken before color was invented. He didn't return the card. Instead, his eyes drifted down to the collar of Willie's coveralls. Pinned, there was a small tarnished piece of brass. It was nondescript, barely larger than a thumbnail with no discernible markings. From a distance, it looked like a piece of junk, something found in a gutter and pinned on for no reason. Thorn reached out and flicked it with his finger. "What's this?" "You're perfect." Attendance award from the sanitation department. The moment his finger touched the metal, the world shifted for Willie. It wasn't a memory, not a full one. It was a flash of sensations, a ghost of a life lived decades ago. The suffocating wet wool heat of a jungle canopy, the metallic tang of blood in his mouth, the rhythmic thumping of helicopter blades cutting through thick, humid air, the oppressive weight of a friend's body slung over his shoulder, the whisper of a dying man's last words against his ear, the glint of that same piece of brass, not tarnished then, but new and gleaming, pressed into his palm by a hand that was already growing cold. It was over in a second, a phantom limb of a past he never spoke of. He blinked, the fluorescent lights of the barracks returning, bright and sterile. He was just an old man leaning on a mop. From a doorway across the hall, Master Chief McIntyre watched the scene unfold, his arms crossed over his chest. Mac was a living legend in the teams, a man who had been through the hell of butter before Thorn was even born. He had a face like a road map of every war zone from the last 30 years and eyes that missed nothing. He had seen Thorn's type before, strong, capable, but with an arrogance that was a liability, a cancer, in a unit. But it wasn't Thorn's bullying that held Mac's attention. It was the janitor. He saw the old man's stillness, the utter lack of fear or indignation. It was a profound and unsettling calm, the kind Mac had only ever seen in men who had walked through the very worst of the fire and come out the other side made of something other than flesh and bone. He watched as Thorn flicked the pin on the old man's collar. Mac squinted, his eyes sharp. He couldn't make out the pin, but he recognized a man's posture. It was the posture of a man who was so fundamentally dangerous that he no longer had any need to prove it. Thorn, meanwhile, was enjoying his performance. He held Willie's ID hostage, dangling it between his thumb and forefinger. The crowd of trainees had grown. No one intervened. This was Thorn's show. "I'm thinking this ID might be fake," Thorn said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I think we need to have the MPs sort this out. A man your age with your condition, you could be a security risk." He took another step, invading Willie's personal space, using his physical size to loom and intimidate. The air crackled with tension. Willie simply stood his ground, his pale blue eyes fixed on Thorn, his expression unreadable. Master Chief McIntyre had seen enough. He didn't step forward. He didn't shout. That would only give Thorn the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he quietly uncrossed his arms, pulled his phone from his pocket, and turned away, melting back into the shadows of the doorway. He scrolled through his contacts, past names labeled S2, Armory, and Rangemaster, until he found the one he was looking for. He pressed the call button and lifted the phone to his ear. The audience in the barracks was now convinced they were about to see an old man arrested, or at least hauled off for questioning. They were about to witness the peak of Thorn's dominance. They and Thorn himself had no idea that help was already on the way. They didn't know that Master Chief McIntyre's call wasn't going to the military police on base. It was going to a number he hadn't dialed in over 5 years, a direct line. "Sir," Mac said, his voice low and urgent, keeping it out of earshot of the drama in the Oh, it's McIntyre. Sorry to bother you, but you're not going to believe this. I'm at the barracks, and I think I'm looking at Willie Pratt. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Yes, sir, M continued, his eyes glancing back at the scene. The Willie Pratt, his cleaning the floor. The response on the other end of the line was immediate and explosive. Mac listened for a moment, his expression grim. Yes, sir. Petty Officer Thorne. He's got him. Cornered now. I think you need to get here fast. He ended the call, a sense of grim certainty settling over him. The cavalry was coming, and Thorne was about to learn a lesson that no amount of surf, torture, or log PT could ever teach him. Inside a sprawling mahogany pan-led office at Naval Special Warfare Command, headquarters 12 miles away, Rear Admiral Franklin Pace slammed his phone down into its cradle. The polished wood vibrated from the impact. His aide, a young, crisp lieutenant, jumped in his chair. Sir, Admiral Pace stood up, his face a thundercloud. He was a man known for his icy calm, a commander who had navigated complex global operations from the quiet of his command center without ever raising his voice. That calm had just been shattered. Get my car, he barked, striding towards the door and grabbing his cover from its stand. Now, and get the base command on the line. Tell him to meet me at the Bard Barracks. Bravo Company 5 minutes ago. Tell him we have a code event. The lieutenant, pale-faced, fumbled with his phone. He had never heard of a code. It wasn't in any of the manuals. Sir, what is a code? Admiral Pace paused at the door, turning back to fix the young officer with a stare that felt like it could strip paint. L stand for legend. It means a living Medal of Honor or Distinguished Service Cross recipient is on this base, unescorted and unrecognized. In this case, it means God himself is on our soil and one of our people is apparently spitting in his face. Move. The lieutenant scrambled into action, his hands flying across his phone as the admiral swept out of the office. The entire command staff was jolted into a state of high alert. A code L. No one knew what it meant, but they knew the admiral's tone. It was the sound of a world about to be turned upside down. Back in the barracks, Thorne was pushing his advantage to its breaking point. Willie's silence was infuriating him, making him feel oddly powerless. Despite his physical dominance, he needed to provoke a reaction to make the old man crack. That's it. I'm done with this, Thorne declared, puffing out his chest. He reached out and grabbed Willie's thin arm. The muscle beneath the loose fabric of the coveralls was surprisingly hard. Like old rope. You're coming with me. We're going to have a nice long chat. With base security. Maybe they can figure out what an old relic like you is doing here. He started to pull Willie toward the main door. It was the ultimate act of hubris, the final step, over a line he didn't even know existed. The other trainees shuffled their feet, a few of them now looking deeply uncomfortable. This had gone from a simple hazing to something much uglier. But Willie did not move. Thorne pulled, but the old man was an anchor. His worn boots seemingly fused to the linoleum. For the first time, a flicker of something other than calm appeared in Willie's eyes. It wasn't anger. It was a profound ancient weariness. The look of a man who had seen humanity at its absolute worst and was disappointed, but not surprised to be seeing it again. Just as Thorne was about to give a more violent tug, a sound from outside cut through the tension. It started as a low rumble and grew rapidly into the squeal of tires on asphalt. It wasn't the sound of a single MP Jeep. It was the sound of a convoy. Heads turned through the large windows of the barracks. They saw a sight that made no sense. 2 black SUVs with government plates and small flags mounted on their front fenders, screeched to a halt, flanked by 2 Marine patrol vehicles, their lights flashing. Doors flew open. The base commander, a captain, known for his stern demeanor, practically fell out of the lead SUV, his face ashen. He was followed by a detail of armed Marines in their dress, blues, who immediately formed a security perimeter, and then from the rear door of the second SUV, Rear Admiral Franklin Pace emerged. He was a commander of all Navy SEALs, a 2-star admiral, a man whose face was known only from official photographs and base-wide addresses. He was a creature of headquarters and high-level strategy, not the gritty reality of the barracks. His presence here was as shocking as a lightning strike on a clear day. The barracks door flew open with a crash. The base commander rushed in, his eyes wide with panic. He saw the scene, and the star trainee holding the old janitor by the arm and a look of pure horror crossed his face. Thorn, utterly bewildered, dropped Willie's arm as if it were red hot. He and every other man in the room snapped to attention. Their backs ramrod straight, their eyes locked. Forward, Admiral Pace strode into the barracks, his presence sucking all the air out of the room. He was followed by Master Chief McIntyre, who stood grimly by the door. The Admiral's eyes, cold and furious, swept over the terrified trainees, over the panic-based commander, and finally landed on Thorn. He looked at the young, powerful SEAL candidate as if he were a piece of dirt on his shoe, but he didn't speak to him. Instead, he walked past Thorn, past everyone, and came to a stop directly in front of the stooped janitor in the red coveralls. Willie Pratt simply watched him approach, his expression unchanged. The room was utterly silent. The only sound was the distant hum of the SUV engines and the frantic beating of 24 hearts. Then the impossible happened. Rear Admiral Franklin Pace, commander of the most elite fighting force in the world, brought his heels together with a sharp click on the linoleum floor. He raised his hand to his brow in a salute, so crisp, so perfect it seemed to cut the air. Mr. Pratt, the Admiral's voice boomed, filled with respect that bordered on reverence. It is an honor, sir. Thorn's jaw went slack. The other trainees stayed in stunned disbelief. They were witnessing a break in the fundamental laws of their universe. A 2-star admiral was saluting a janitor. Willie slowly, almost tiredly, raised a hand and gave a slight nod. It was not a return of the salute, but an acknowledgement, an acceptance. The admiral held his salute for a long moment before dropping his hand. He then turned to face the assembled SEAL candidates, his gaze sweeping over their shocked faces until it locked onto Thorn. Do you have any idea who this is? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Thorn, pale and trembling, could only shake his head. No, sir, you don't. The Admiral continued, his voice rising with controlled fury. You see an old man, a janitor, someone in your way. You are training to be the tip of the spear, but you have no concept of the history, of the steel that forged it. He gestured toward Willie. This is Willie Pratt. In 1966, he was a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army attached to a new highly classified unit, a little thing called MUCSUG, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group. He was running crossbow reconnaissance into Laos and Cambodia when your fathers were still in diapers. A murmur went through the room. MacVog, they were legends, ghosts from the history books. Their operations were the stuff of whispered, half-believed stories. This man, the Admiral said, his voice now ringing with a terrible clarity, was part of a 6-man team that was inserted onto a hilltop deep in enemy territory. They were compromised and surrounded by a Full regiment of North Vietnamese. Regulars, over 1,000 of them, against 6. The Admiral took a step toward Thorne, who looked as if he might faint. For 2 days and 2 nights, they held that hill. Willie Pratt, armed with a rifle and a handful of grenades, personally repelled a dozen human wave assaults. When his commanding officer was hit, he took command. When their radio man was killed, he held the enemy off with one hand while cooling in air strikes with the other, directing fire. So close he was deafened by the blasts and burned by the napalm. When they ran out of ammunition, they used their knives in their bare hands. By the time reinforcements arrived, only Willie and one other man was still alive, surrounded by the bodies of over 200 enemy soldiers. He pointed a finger at Thorne's chest. The tactics you are learning in this program, the small unit strategies, the very concept of unconventional warfare that you think is so modern. Men like Willie Pratt wrote that book. They wrote it in blood, in the mud, in the rain, a world away from here. The Admiral then turned his gaze to the small tarnished pin on Willie's collar. For his actions on that hill, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, our nation's second highest award. For Valor, he was recommended for the Medal of Honor, but the mission was so secret it was buried for decades. This pin, he said, his voice softening with awe, is not from the sanitation department. It is a piece of the first grenade casing he ever used in combat. A reminder. The silence in the room was now absolute, heavy with shame and awe. Every eye was on Willie, who looked not like a hero, but like a man profoundly tired, a man who had carried the weight of that hill for more than 50 years. Then the Admiral delivered the final crushing blow. He turned back to the petrified Thorne. Petty officer, he commanded, his voice like ice. Unsling your weapon. Thorne fumbled with his M4 rifle, his hand shaking so badly he could barely work the clasp. He held the weapon out, handed to Mr. Pratt. Thorne obeyed, his eyes wide with terror and confusion. He stepped forward and presented the rifle to the old janitor. The moment Willie's hands touched the modern polymer and steel weapon, a transformation occurred. It was subtle, but total. The weary stoop in his shoulders vanished. His back straightened. The 81-year-old janitor disappeared, and in his place stood a soldier. His hands, which had trembled, holding his wallet, were now rock steady. They moved with an innate, terrifying familiarity over the rifle's controls. His grip was perfect, his trigger discipline flawless. He brought the weapon up to his shoulder in a single fluid motion, his eye aligning perfectly with the sight. He checked the magazine, worked the charging handle, and scanned the room, his gaze sweeping over the trainees with an intensity that made them feel like targets. He did it, all in less than 2 seconds. It was a display of economy and purpose that no amount of training could replicate. It was instinct. It was mastery. He held the pose for a heartbeat, a silent, powerful lesson for every man in the room. Then, with the same fluid efficiency, he made the weapon safe, ejected the magazine, and handed it back to a ghostly white Thorne. The Admiral let the lesson sink in before he spoke. Again, his voice a low growl directed at Thorne. You stand on the shoulders of giant petty officer, and today you were spitting on the man who built the very foundation you stand on. You are a disgrace to that uniform and to the memory of every operator who came before you. He then turned to Willie, his expression softening completely. Mr. Pratt, Willie, is there anything we can do for you? Willie looked at the Admiral, at the terrified young men, at the mop and bucket sitting in a puddle on the floor. He gave a small, sad smile. The uniform changes, Admiral, he said, his growly voice filling the silent room. The job doesn't. Respect isn't in the rank. It's in the work. It's owned. Every day. In here, he said, gesturing to the barracks. And out there, he looked at Thorn, not with anger, but with a hint of pity. The boy is just young. He hasn't learned yet that the toughest enemy is the one you see in the mirror every morning. As he spoke of earning respect, a final clear image bloomed in Willie's mind. Not a flash, this time, but a full painful memory. He was back in the mud of that forgotten hill. His friend, a young sergeant named Danny, was dying in his arms. The battle was over, the silence deafening. Danny, with his last breath, had pressed a small piece of brass into Willie's hand. It was from the grenade that had saved them during the first assault. Don't let them forget us, Willie, Danny had whispered, his eyes already losing focus. Don't let them forget this place. Willie had closed his hand around it, the metal, still warm, and had made a silent promise. The fallout was swift and decisive. Petty Officer Thorne was not kicked out of the SEAL program. Admiral Pace, in a moment of wisdom, decided that would be too easy. Instead, Thorne was recycled. He was sent back today. Week 1 of Bud/Force 2. Start the entire grueling 6-month ordeal. All over again. It was a profound humiliation, a public declaration of his failure, not of body, but of character. He would have to earn his way back, inch by painful inch, under the watchful eyes of instructors who now knew his story. For the institution, the change was more significant. Admiral Pace mandated a new addition to the BUD curriculum. It was a non-negotiable history course, taught by Master Chief McIntyre himself, focusing on the origins of naval special warfare and its roots in shadowy operations of units like MVZO. The first lecture was titled simply The Legacy of Willie Pratt, an oversized, framed photograph of a young staff. Sergeant Pratt in Vietnam was hung in the main hall of the training center, a permanent reminder to every candidate of the history they were inheriting. The base offered Willie a formal apology and a quiet pension increase, which he politely accepted, but he didn't quit his job. The next day, he was back in the barracks with his mop and bucket, the floors gleaming under his slow, steady care. His presence, however, had changed. He was no longer an invisible old man. The trainees spoke to him with a quiet, reverent respect. They held doors for him. They asked him if he needed anything. They saw him not as a janitor but as a living monument. Weeks later, a much-changed Thorne, now a lowly trainee again, gaunt and humbled, from the brutal Remus into Hell Week, saw Willie sitting alone in the mess hall, slowly eating his lunch. After a long moment of hesitation, Thorne picked up his tray, walked over, and stood before the old man's table. Willie looked up, his pale blue eyes questioning. Thorne swallowed hard. The arrogance long since scoured out of him. "Mr. Pratt," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "Sir, I could you tell me about Danny?" Willie looked at the young man for a long time. He saw the shame in his eyes, but also a flicker of genuine curiosity, of a desire to understand. He gave a slow nod and gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down, son." Willie Pratt said, "Let me tell you about a real hero. If you were moved by Willie's story, please like this video, share it with someone who respects our veterans, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more tales of unassuming heroes